I woke to the sterile hush of machines and the slow, steady beep of something that felt tethered to my heartbeat. My eyes opened reluctantly, every movement dragging like they were stitched shut. The ceiling above me was too white, too flat, almost humming with its own artificial stillness. I blinked, once, twice. The light overhead stabbed into my skull, making the edges of my vision throb with a dull pain that radiated backwards, into my spine, into my teeth. My tongue was heavy, coated. When I tried to move it, I tasted iron. My lips parted on instinct, dry and cracked, and I felt the sickly copper of dried blood at the corner of my mouth. I didn't remember how I got there, not immediately. Just sensations, a flash of movement, screeching tires, the impact, jarring, violent, and sudden, like being snapped out of reality and slammed into something cold and blind. My ribs hurt, a deep, sharp ache that sat beneath every breath like a warning. My wrists were stiff, bruised. Something tugged at the skin near my elbow, a line of tape holding down an IV. The blankets were rough, layered too tightly around me, pinning me like I might drift away if left untethered. The room was quiet, unnaturally so, as if sound had been drained from the space and replaced with antiseptic silence. I turned my head slowly, the motion dragging like I was underwater. The walls were pale blue, the paint chipped near the corners. A small window faced the parking lot, rain trailing lazy lines down the glass. The world beyond looked as distant as a memory I didn't own. I tried to move my fingers. They obeyed, barely. My legs twitched beneath the sheet. There was pain, yes, but more than that, emptiness. Like parts of me had been hollowed out and stitched back together without asking who I used to be. My throat burned, not just from dryness, but from silence. I couldn't remember the last thing I said, or to whom. A nurse must have been here, a doctor, someone. But no one stood near me now. No voice to assure me that I was safe, or stable, or alive. I lifted my arm slightly and winced. Every muscle screamed in protest. I lowered it again, breathing through the flare of heat and nausea that followed. The smell of bleach hovered in the air, sharp and familiar, clinging to the corners of the room like something waiting. Time moved strangely. Minutes folded into each other, shapeless and slow. I drifted in and out, never quite sleeping, never fully awake. The lights dimmed slightly at some point, signaling night, though the sky had already been gray. I lay there, still and listening, searching for sound. A footstep, a voice, anything. But all I had was the beep, beep, beep of the machine beside me, reminding me I was still tethered to something, still counted, still here. I began to catalog the pain. Left side, bruised ribs. Right leg, sharp twinge, possibly fractured. Head, persistent pressure, centered above the temple. Chest, tight, as if wrapped in something too small. But under all of it was a deeper sensation, not physical, not even fear. It was something else, something less defined, a sense that I was not alone, though no one stood beside me. The air shifted around me, like someone had just left or was about to enter. My skin prickled, not from cold, from awareness. I thought of death, not in a dramatic way, not with panic, but with strange clarity. It could have come. Maybe it almost did. Maybe it still might. I didn't know how long I'd been there, what day it was, who had found me, whether anyone even knew I was here. The world outside could have continued on without me, silent and unbothered. And here I was, suspended in this blank white room, blood in my mouth, thoughts crawling like insects across the surface of my mind. A noise then, barely perceptible, the swish of fabric, a door clicking shut. I didn't turn toward it. I couldn't, but I felt it, the subtle shift in atmosphere, like heat walking into a cold room. Something changed. The scent of lavender and alcohol followed, threading into the stale air. Footsteps padded quietly across the floor, unhurried, controlled. Someone was here. And in that moment, I realized something peculiar. The panic I expected never arrived. Instead, there was a strange calm. My body still hurt, my head still throbbed, my mouth still tasted like rust. But beneath all that, something opened, something low and wide and waiting. I didn't know who had entered the room. I didn't know what they would say or do, but my chest ached in a new way, not from the accident, not from the damage, but from anticipation, from something awakening that had nothing to do with pain or recovery or survival. It was the beginning of something I didn't understand yet, something that would pull me out of the wreckage, not just of a car, but of myself. The nights blurred into each other, each one indistinguishable from the last. Silent corridors, dimmed lights, the occasional hum of passing carts. But she became the constant, the only thread of consistency in a space suspended outside of time. She entered my room like a quiet rhythm, never abrupt, always steady. Her presence didn't jolt me, it soothed, like the sound of a familiar song playing low in the background, one I couldn't name, but somehow remembered by heart. Her name tag flashed silver under the soft fluorescent lights, but I rarely looked at it. I didn't need to. I learned her name by the shape of her voice, the cadence of her steps, the weight of her hands as they moved across my body with a kind of professional grace that always felt a degree too gentle. She never rushed, not with me. Everything she did was precise, but there was softness to her movements that felt separate from the task. When she adjusted my IV or changed the dressing on my side, she did it as if tending to something fragile, something personal. Her fingers were cool at first touch, but they warmed quickly, skin to skin, like they were learning me. I started recognizing the hours by her. When she entered the room, it was always the same. A quiet knock, the click of the door, the rustle of her scrubs. I'd pretend to be asleep sometimes, just to feel the care in her movements without interruption. Her hands would brush over my arm as she checked the pulse oximeter, and I would focus on the sensation, how lightly she touched, how her fingertips lingered for a second longer than necessary before letting go. She would press a stethoscope to my chest, ask me to breathe, and though I followed instructions, my mind always drifted. Not to the pain, not to the accident, but to the space between us, that narrowing gap that neither of us addressed. I memorized the pattern of her care, the way she rolled the blood pressure cuff, wrapped it neatly, pulled it snug with a fluid motion that revealed the strength in her wrists, the way she opened alcohol swabs with a flick of her fingers, her nails clean and trimmed. The scent of antiseptic began to comfort me, not because it signified healing, but because it meant she was near. She always smelled faintly of soap and something floral, something mild that clung to the fabric of her uniform and stayed in the room even after she left. There were nights when her touch felt almost intimate, though nothing in her expression betrayed it. I was just another patient, a body to tend to, a name on a chart. But my skin started to respond to her differently. When she pulled the sheet back to check my sutures, my breath caught, not from fear, from something else, a tightening in my chest that wasn't discomfort, but awareness. My body knew her before my mind was willing to admit it. Each brush of her hand across my side, each moment her palm pressed into the mattress beside me for balance, it all imprinted on me like ritual. Sometimes she sat beside the bed longer than required, writing notes or adjusting the machine settings. I watched her profile when I thought she wouldn't notice. The curve of her neck, the concentration in her brow, the way her lips moved slightly when she was thinking. I began to look forward to those moments more than the painkillers, more than the visits from the day shift doctors. They brought charts and clipped voices. She brought silence and breath. Her hands learned me, learned my reactions, knew where I flinched, knew when to go slow, knew when to press and when to pause. I started to crave her presence the way a body craves water, not indulgently, but necessitarily. She became my rhythm, my reset. When I had nightmares, and I had many, it was her voice that anchored me. Not loud, not urgent, just near, just enough. Her hand on my shoulder, her palm on my wrist, grounding me without intrusion. I didn't speak much. I didn't have to. She read the small signs, the twitch in my fingers, the way my eyes followed her movements. I felt exposed under her care, not because I was vulnerable, but because she saw me in the rawest state a person could be seen. Not dressed, not composed, not guarded, just a body on a bed, healing in fits and starts. But I never felt ashamed. Her presence made it bearable. Her hands turned the clinical into something strangely sacred. There was one night I remember more vividly than the rest. She was adjusting the pillows behind my back, and her fingers brushed along my spine. Just a glide, nothing more, but I shivered. She hesitated for half a second, just long enough for me to wonder if she'd felt it too. Her hand stilled, then resumed its motion as if nothing had happened, but my skin remembered. It still does. I started needing her, not just as a nurse, but as a sensation. I would lay awake, anticipating the moment the door creaked open, the shift in the air, the weight of her hand on my wrist. Each gesture, each routine movement became laced with a quiet intimacy that neither of us named. I counted the hours by her visits, marked time and touch, in the careful placement of her fingers, in the silence between our breaths. Her hands were never tentative. She touched with the confidence of someone who knew what she was doing, but I felt something underneath it, an awareness, a restraint, as if she too was careful not to cross a line. But lines blur when you're in pain, when the only comfort you find comes not from medication, but from the shape of another person's hands. Her care didn't feel distant, it felt chosen. And somewhere in the space between her hand on my chest and the slow rise of my breath beneath it, I realized something had shifted. I was still healing, still broken, still unsure of the world beyond the hospital walls. But in her hands, I felt more than safe. I felt wanted, not explicitly, not obviously, but enough to keep me reaching for that next touch, that next night, that next moment when her skin met mine and reminded me I was still here, still alive, still capable of feeling something more than pain. Pain has a way of redefining time. It stretches the minutes, distorts the hours, makes the days feel like years. At first, my body was nothing but a map of aches, sharp where the bones had bruised, dull where the skin had split, burning where sutures pulled tight over flesh that hadn't yet agreed to stay closed. I had grown used to it, or rather, I had stopped resisting it. Pain became a quiet companion, always there, humming under the surface of every breath, every twitch, every heartbeat. But something changed when she entered the room. Something shifted, not in the nature of the pain, but in the way my body reacted to it, as if her presence rewrote the terms of my suffering. I started to realize it during one of the longer nights, the kind of night where the ceiling feels closer than it should, and the corners of the room press in with a gentle pressure that makes it hard to breathe. I had been clenching my jaw, trying to breathe through the soreness in my ribs, the tight pull of my side where the deepest gash had been sewn together. I didn't press the call button. I didn't want the interruption, but she came anyway, like she always did, quiet as a shadow. She moved to the side of the bed, hands already pulling on gloves, eyes scanning the monitors with a practiced calm. But as she leaned over me, the pain receded. Not vanished, not entirely, but dulled, softened, blurred like fog across glass. Her fingers brushed against the inside of my wrist, and I closed my eyes just to feel it more fully. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, and the weight in my chest lifted, just enough for me to draw a fuller breath. When she adjusted the bandages, I should have winced, but I didn't. I felt her fingers press into my side, and instead of pain, I felt stillness, peace. It was more than distraction, more than comfort. It was as if her presence muted everything else. My nerves, usually screaming with every touch, began to quiet when she was near. The edges of my thoughts, usually frayed with worry and restlessness, began to smooth. Her presence created a kind of perimeter around the bed, a small, invisible barrier where nothing sharp could enter. Even my dreams changed. On the nights she lingered longer, sat beside me while charting or checking vitals, I didn't dream of headlights and twisted metal. I didn't wake up gasping for air. I woke up calm, as if I had been held in the softness of her orbit all night long. I watched her more, watched the way her fingers moved, methodical, confident, but always gentle. She touched like someone who understood exactly how much pain the body could endure and exactly how much it needed to heal. When she lifted my arm to check the IV, she cradled it in her palm like it was something breakable. I started imagining what her hands would feel like outside the frame of duty, what it would be like to be touched not out of necessity, but out of want. And every time I let my mind wander there, my pain vanished altogether. Even when she wasn't in the room, the memory of her hands lingered. I'd press my palm against the place she'd held, trace the outline of where her fingertips had brushed against my skin. I stopped asking for extra medication. I didn't need it. What I needed was her. Her voice, low and steady. Her hands, always cool at first, then warm as they settled. Her breath, sometimes just audible when she leaned in close to listen to mine. She was the only thing that made my body feel like it was still mine. Sometimes she would sit on the edge of the bed for a moment too long. Not enough to break rules, not enough to be noticed by anyone outside the room, but enough for me to feel something shift. Her thigh would press gently into the mattress, the slightest contact, and the ache in my leg would dull to nothing. I would lie there, hyper-aware of the closeness, the heat that passed between us, and I would forget where the pain had once lived. Her nearness became the anesthesia I didn't have to sign for. My body started responding differently, not just to her touch, but to her absence. When she wasn't on shift, I felt it instantly. The air was wrong, the light too harsh. The other nurses moved too quickly, too loud, too impersonal. Their hands didn't know me. Their hands didn't ask permission the way hers did, even when she didn't speak. I endured their care. I waited for hers. My recovery felt slower without her, my breath shallower, my thoughts darker. She became the only part of the routine that made sense. I began to wonder if she knew, if she felt the stillness in me when she entered the room, if she noticed how my heart rate steadied when she placed her fingers against my neck, if she sensed the way I leaned into her presence, quiet and aching for more. I didn't speak of it. There was no space for that. But the silence between us was full of something unspoken, suspended between us like heat rising from skin. One night, she brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. Just that, a simple movement, but I closed my eyes and let it wash over me like a wave. My body stopped hurting entirely in that moment, not because the injuries were gone, but because they no longer mattered, because every nerve in me was focused on her, on the weight of her hand, the closeness of her body, the way the world faded when she was near. She made my pain disappear, not with medicine, not with technique, but with presence, with touch, with something that lived between professionalism and something deeper, something I didn't dare name, not yet. But it lived in the space where her fingers met my skin, and in that space, I could finally breathe. I could finally rest. I could finally begin to feel whole again. The night was still, thick with the kind of silence that presses against the windows and holds the world in place. The hallway outside my room had fallen quiet hours ago, footsteps long faded, voices distant echoes swallowed by soft tile and fluorescent light. I lay awake, skin sensitive beneath the hospital gown, nerves exposed in ways that had nothing to do with pain. My body felt too alive, too alert, every breath drawn with a strange kind of anticipation I didn't fully understand. The blankets clung to me like a second skin, but they couldn't cover what had begun to stir beneath the surface. She entered without sound, as she always did, her presence slipping through the room like light under a door. Her scrubs were the same pale blue, her hair tied back neatly, but her eyes met mine with a weight I hadn't felt before. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply moved, slowly, purposefully, like a current pulling forward, inevitable and quiet. The door closed behind her, and the room sealed shut from the rest of the world. Her hands were bare. She didn't reach for gloves or a chart or a monitor. She came to my side and paused, eyes scanning me not like a patient, but like something else entirely, something alive and waiting. Her fingers reached for the hem of my blanket and pulled it down with care, exposing the thin fabric of my gown. I didn't flinch. My breath caught, but I didn't stop her. My chest rose slowly, the cotton clinging to my skin. Her touch landed lightly on my collarbone, her thumb brushing against the thin line of bruising there, tracing the edge of healing with reverence. She began to unfasten the gown, slow movements, steady fingers, the sound of Velcro peeling apart like breath held too long. The air in the room shifted, grew warmer, heavier, like we'd stepped into a different atmosphere where language no longer applied. She peeled the fabric open gently, revealing the bandages beneath. The seams of recovery stretched across my torso like a map of what had broken. Her eyes didn't turn away. She didn't avert her gaze from the scars or the bruises or the places where my skin had darkened. Instead, she leaned in. Her fingers slid under the edge of the dressing at my ribs, and she began to remove it, 1 inch at a time. The adhesive pulled softly at my skin, the sensation both sharp and tender. Her movements were slow, careful, not because I was fragile, but because something in the moment demanded it. When the last of the bandage came free, she paused. Her fingers hovered just above my skin, close enough to feel the warmth, the quiet pulse of life beneath the surface. Then she touched me. Not clinically, not out of necessity. She ran the back of her fingers along my side, tracing the edge of the healing wound, her touch feather-light but deliberate. I shivered, not from cold, but from the way her skin met mine. My breath deepened. My legs shifted slightly under the sheet. My hands clenched the sides of the mattress. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to the edge of the scar, the contact so soft it felt imagined. But it wasn't. Her mouth was warm, her breath shallow against my skin. She kissed along the line of healing, not with hunger, but with devotion. I felt something unravel inside me, slow and deep, like a knot finally loosening after years of tension. I closed my eyes, letting the sensations rise. Her hands moved again, this time lower. She traced down my stomach, over the slight swell of my hip, fingertips brushing the place where my body curved and met the bed. My gown hung open now, the cotton parting like a veil, and I lay exposed beneath her, bare to the dim light and her gaze. I didn't cover myself. I didn't speak. I simply looked at her, and she looked back, and nothing about the moment felt unnatural. She slid her hands beneath the gown and helped me sit up slightly. The fabric slipped from my shoulders and pulled at my waist, then lower until it was gone entirely. I was naked in the hospital bed, the air cool against my skin, the warmth of her body a contrast that made me tremble. She didn't rush. She let her eyes wander over me, taking in the lines, the bruises, the softness beneath the surface. Her hand cupped my jaw, thumb stroking across my cheekbone. I leaned into it, my lips brushing the inside of her wrist. Then her mouth found mine. It was slow at first, an exhale, a meeting of warmth, a press that deepened as my hand slid up her arms. Her kiss was full, consuming, her body leaning over mine as her hand traced the side of my breast, then lower, curving gently beneath. I gasped into her mouth, and she swallowed the sound like it belonged to her. I arched, seeking more, aching in places untouched by pain, but desperate to be filled. Her hand moved between my thighs, and when her fingers touched me there, I felt the world narrow to nothing but the point of contact. I opened for her without thought, without fear. Her touch was slow, exploratory, almost reverent. She kissed down my throat, over the line of my collarbone, between my breasts, lips brushing every inch like a promise. Her fingers moved in rhythm with my breath, building, circling, coaxing. I felt myself rise, higher, tighter, the tension curling through my stomach, my thighs, my chest. I moaned, not loud, but full. My hips lifted, and she followed, guiding me, holding me as I began to fall apart. When I came, it was quiet. No scream, no words, just a long, shaking breath and the sensation of everything inside me melting into something warm and bright and whole. She held me as I trembled, her mouth pressed to my shoulder, her arms wrapped around my waist. I sank into the pillows, eyes glazed, heart pounding in my ears. My body was weightless, my pain gone, not numbed, but replaced. She pulled the blanket over me, then climbed into the bed beside me, one arm beneath my neck, the other across my chest. Her skin pressed against mine, her breath slow and even. I closed my eyes and felt the shape of her body next to mine like an anchor. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I only breathed her in, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I belonged in my own skin. The morning light didn't drift in gently. It pierced, harsh, sterile, uninvited. The soft hush of night had been replaced by the sharp clatter of metal trays, the squeak of rubber soles on polished floors, the dry murmur of voices through walls too thin to hide them. I lay still, the warmth of her body no longer beside me, the sheets suddenly cold where her weight had been. My eyes opened slowly, and the ceiling looked different, less forgiving, more distant, as if the entire room had exhaled and I had been left behind in the void that followed. The scent lingered first, her skin, her hair, the faint trace of lavender and hospital soap. It haunted the pillow, clung to the sheets, embedded itself into the curve of my neck. But she was gone. No arm draped across my waist, no soft breath on the back of my shoulder, no fingers curled gently around mine, just the ghost of touch and the silence of absence. I sat up slowly, the ache returning to my joints like a punishment. My body felt used, but not broken, marked in ways that had nothing to do with trauma and everything to do with memory. The blanket slipped from my chest, exposing skin that had been kissed, held, worshipped in the dark hours before sunrise. Now, in the bright emptiness of morning, it felt raw. My nipples still tingled from her mouth. My thighs trembled with the echo of her touch. But she wasn't there to meet my gaze, to confirm that what had happened wasn't just imagined. I reached for my gown, found it neatly folded on the chair, not tossed, not forgotten, folded with care, as if she wanted to leave no trace, as if she had never been there at all. My hands shook as I dressed, not from pain, but from the slow, creeping realization that something sacred had been stripped of context by the arrival of daylight. What had been intimate, transformative, had now become a secret the sun was not meant to see. The door opened suddenly, and for a breathless second, I thought it might be her, that she'd return, smiling, eyes still heavy with the night we'd shared, mouth parting to say something soft, something real. But it wasn't. It was another nurse, older, stricter, all crisp professionalism and tired efficiency. She didn't look at me, didn't notice the way my body flinched as she approached. She checked the monitors, adjusted the IV, asked standard questions in a tone that made it clear she didn't care much about the answers. I asked where she was, the night nurse, the one with the quiet voice and the steady hands, the one who had stayed with me through the long hours when pain blurred into longing. The older nurse frowned, confused. There had been no young woman on shift, she said. Not last night, not on any night this week. I must have been mistaken. Maybe the meds, maybe a dream. My heart stuttered. I repeated the name I thought I'd heard whispered in the dark. The older woman shook her head, unimpressed. No one by that name worked in the unit. Not recently. Not ever. She scribbled something on her clipboard and left as quickly as she came. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I was alone again. The room felt different now. Not just empty, hollow, like the very walls had turned against me. The sheets smelled only faintly of her now, as if her presence was evaporating second by second. I stared at the ceiling, disbelief crawling like ice along my spine. My fingers pressed to my lips, trying to find traces of her kiss, the proof that she had been real. But doubt seeped in like water through cracks. Had I imagined it all? Had my mind, softened by pain and isolation, conjured her from longing and stitched her into the night like a fevered mirage? I reached beneath the blanket, touched the inside of my thigh where her mouth had once been, where I had felt her warmth and weight and breath. My skin still pulsed there, tender and alive, and I knew, I knew that it had been real. My body remembered, even if the hospital chose to forget, even if the world denied her existence. My body, marked by her hands, by her mouth, by the rhythm we created together, refused to let go. And yet the morning betrayed me. It took what was sacred and cast it in doubt. It scrubbed away the softness, replaced it with fluorescent light and clipped voices and cold charts. There was no place for what we had become, no space for the truth of it to live outside the night. I curled into myself, knees pulled tight, arms wrapped around my torso, as if I could still hold her that way. But she was gone, slipped through my fingers like breath in cold air. The clock ticked. The machines beeped. Nurses moved past my door like I was just another bed, just another body. But I knew better. My body had been opened in more ways than one. And now, in the harsh silence of morning, I was left with nothing but the ache where she had been, and the unbearable knowledge that healing had never felt so much like breaking. It happened weeks later, when the hospital was already behind me like the residue of a long, uneven dream. The bruises had faded from my skin, though I still found phantom aches in the places where pain had once lived. My body had healed more quickly than expected, but the rest of me, my thoughts, my memories, the hollow echo she'd left behind, had refused to mend. I moved through my life with practiced normalcy, going through routines like someone half awake, as if everything since that night had been muffled by cotton and fog. But she lingered in every quiet moment, every untouched space in my bed, every half-formed thought I never dared to say aloud. Her absence was louder than most people's presence. It was a Tuesday when I saw her again. I wasn't prepared. I was walking through the frozen foods aisle of a grocery store I didn't even usually go to, pushing a cart I didn't need, aimlessly moving from one brightly lit shelf to another. I remember the cold, the way it bit at my fingers even through the thin fabric of my gloves. And then I felt it, that pull, that sudden, unmistakable shift in gravity, like the air itself had recognized something before I had. I turned my head, slowly, not trusting the instinct, and there she was. She stood just a few feet away, one hand hovering over a freezer door, her eyes focused on a carton of something she clearly hadn't yet decided to pick up. She looked exactly the same, hair pulled back, posture relaxed but sure of itself, the same deliberate stillness I had once memorized from a hospital bed. But something was off. Something didn't match. She was wearing a different uniform, something more casual, the badge on her chest unfamiliar. I moved closer before I even realized what I was doing, the cart forgotten somewhere behind me. She turned. Our eyes met. And in that instant, something inside me caved. She looked at me like I was a stranger. Not startled, not embarrassed, not avoiding, just blank recognition, the polite curiosity you show someone who might look vaguely familiar but means nothing. I felt a wave of heat crawl up my spine, the blood draining from my hands. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. My chest tightened. I tried again. Her name, the one I'd whispered into the dark that night, the one that had pulsed in my memory every morning since. I said it like a question and a prayer. She smiled, small, rehearsed, distant. She said she didn't know me. Her voice was the same, low and careful, but the warmth I remembered was gone. I stood there, frozen, feeling the ground slip sideways beneath my feet. I repeated myself. I told her we had met at the hospital. I mentioned the room, the night shift, the way her hands had felt on my skin. Her expression didn't change. A furrow of concern, maybe, a hint of discomfort, but no recognition. She said I was mistaken, that she had never worked at that hospital, that I must have confused her with someone else. I laughed, not out of amusement, but disbelief. My heart raced in my ears, loud and uneven. I stared at her, searching for a crack in the mask, a flicker of acknowledgement, anything. But there was nothing, just her eyes, kind and empty, and the quiet apology she offered before turning away. She left her cart behind and walked toward the exit, her steps measured, unhurried. I followed, not because I expected anything, not because I believed she would suddenly turn around and remember, but because I couldn't not follow. She moved through the automatic doors and out into the parking lot, her hair catching the wind, her figure cutting through the fading afternoon light. I stood there at the threshold, watching her vanish between rows of cars until I could no longer pretend she might look back. The cold bit harder then. I went home with nothing in my hands and everything unraveling inside me. I stood in my kitchen with the lights off, letting the silence fill the space where her voice had once lived. I poured a glass of water, held it in both hands, and thought about how real it had felt. Her breath on my neck, her fingers inside me, her mouth whispering over my scars. My body didn't lie. My skin still ached in the places she had touched. My thighs still tightened at the memory of her voice, her weight, the way she had pressed herself into me like she belonged there. So who was she? A ghost? A delusion born of trauma? A figment shaped by isolation and longing? Or something worse, a truth so unbearable that it had to be erased? I lay in bed that night, naked under the sheets, tracing the lines she had once kissed. My hand slid over my stomach, between my legs, not to seek pleasure, but to remember, to prove to myself that it had happened, that I had been opened in a way that didn't close cleanly. My body responded the same. My breath caught, my hips arched, but the ache didn't fade. It deepened. I cried, not loudly, not violently, but steadily, salt against lips that had once kissed hers. In the morning, I checked the hospital records. Her name wasn't listed, not in the staff database, not on the schedules, not in HR, nothing. It was as if she had never worked there at all. And yet, I had not imagined her. I could still feel her fingers, still taste her kiss, still remember how she whispered my name like it meant something. And maybe that was the most cruel part of it all. She had touched me into existence and then left me alone with the proof.